Good evening. Even though it's late tonight, I had to share the life of J.B. Lightfoot, who died in 1889, a wonderful commentator and theologian. I was surprised there's very little in his biography. There's one or two monographs that he's a historian, a church historian and commentator, but there are not the great big Victorian works on his life, or it seems to be. I think that's a crying shame, and I hope some academic somewhere around the world will rectify that and write a new biography on this amazing scholar. And he deserves to be remembered far more than he is. He is a quintessential expositor of the Word of God, and his scholarship that he did on the early church fathers was momentous, to say the least. We are using an article by the scholar Professor Bruce, and so we will begin. Why am I doing this so late in the evening? It is because the church needs to get back to expounding the Bible. Lightfoot believed very strongly in the historical grammatical method. That is to say, looking at the Bible in its historical context. He believed fully in the divine inspiration of the Word of God, but he also believed in studying it accurately and faithfully in its context. And as Augustine said when he was teaching his students how to be great preachers of the Word, he said there are three things you need to know: context, context, context. And so I'm a great believer myself in expository preaching, and a great believer in teaching theology students the importance of proper exegesis in getting the text in its historical context. So let's begin. Joseph Barber Lightfoot was born in Liverpool in 1828. His family moved to Birmingham, where from 1844, Barber Lightfoot was born in Liverpool in 1828. His family moved to Birmingham, where from 1844 he was educated at King's Edward School under the headmastership of James Prince Lee, later first Bishop of Manchester. At school, he formed a lifelong friendship with E.W. Benson, destined to become Archbishop of Canterbury. In 1847, he entered Trinity College, Cambridge, where one of his classical tutors was Brooke Foss Westcott, his senior by only 3 years, a very famous commentator, and himself a former pupil of King's Edward School, Birmingham. He took double first in classics and mathematics, and in 1852 he was elected a Fellow of Trinity, becoming a tutor in the college 5 years later. He was ordained deacon in 1854 and priest in 1858, on both occasions at the hands of Bishop Prince Lee. In 1861, he became Hussein Professor of Divinity at Cambridge, and in 1875, Lady Margaret's Professor. He had been appointed to canonry at St. Paul's in 1871. In 1879, he was preferred to the See of Durham, where he remained until his death in 1889. Major task. In his earlier years as a college teacher, he taught classics as well as Greek New Testament. At one time, he contemplated producing a critical edition of Euripides to those years too, belonging the short-lived Journal of Classical and Sacred Theology in 1854 to 1859, of which he was joint editor. To his mastery of classical literature, he added a wide and exact acquaintance with Greek and Latin fathers. 5 years after taking his degree, he began to study the letters of Ignatius, an exercise which was to engage his attention for the next 30 years. What is to be remembered is that Lightfoot was an expert in a variety of languages. He knew a whole raft of languages, which helped him in his study of the text of the Bible, because he was able to get a classical understanding of the times. From 1871 to 1881, Lightfoot was also an active member of the New Testament Company of Revisers. The thought which he devoted to his work is illustrated in his essay on a refreshed revision of the English New Testament, 1871. Now, I don't agree with that. Definitely don't agree with that. More Textus Receptus, but I'll let that pass because he did amazing work in other departments. In 1859 to 1860, evidently in response to suggestion by Macmillan, the publisher Lightfoot agreed with Westcott and another Trinity man, F.J. Hort, Lightfoot's exact contemporary, to collaborate in producing a commentary on the Greek text of the New Testament. These guys, Westcott did a brilliant commentary on John, but they were not as sound as they should have been. So he collaborated in producing a commentary on the Greek text of the New Testament, critically edited. Lightfoot was to be responsible for the Pauline epistles. None of the three completed his assignment, but Lightfoot came nearer to completion than either of the other two, whom in 1853 to 1881 were engaged on their own critical edition of the New Testament text. Lightfoot might have come nearer to completion had he not given too much time to task which in the lighter contemporary study of early Christianity was even more urgent. You see, on the continent, the critical scholarship was attacking the authority and inspiration of the Bible. But what Lightfoot was able to do, he was able to study the early church fathers, which was helping to date the New Testament more early. He was therefore heavily involved in historical and critical examination of the writings of the Apostolic Fathers, particularly Clement of Rome, Ignatius, and Polycarp. The importance of this task can be readily appreciated. The influence of the school of Ferdinand Christian Barr, died 1860, and his Tübingen associate and pupils had advocated a chronological reconstruction of early Christian literature, which placed the Gospel and Acts so late as to be practically valueless as historical sources. Only 4 of the Pauline epistles, 1 and 2, Corinthians, Galatians, and Romans, and the Apocalypse could be dated in the Apostolic Age. This is according to the Tübingen School. The remaining New Testament books reflected a time when the tension of the Apostolic Age had been resolved, and this, according to Barr, B-A-U-R, could not well be earlier than the middle of the 2nd century. Now, Clement of Rome, Ignatius, and Polycarp all flourished before the middle of the 2nd century. To all of them are ascribed letters still extant, which presuppose some at least of the New Testament writings. Ignatius is especially important. He met his death in Principate of Trajan in 98 to 170 AD, and the letters which have come down under his name reflect the stage of the church life and administration in advance of that reflected in the New Testament. The genuineness of Ignatian letters was bound to be denied by Barr and his school, and if their genuineness could be established, it would no longer be possible to date most of the New Testament in the second half of the 2nd century. The establishment of the genuineness of 7 of them was Lightfoot's achievement, and it was a magnificent achievement to say the least. It pushed back critical scholarship and put the traditional views of the authorship of Pauline epistles and other New Testament books earlier into the 1st century because of his sterling work. The tensions of the Apostolic Age were real enough, and their resolutions, however, belong not to the 2nd century but to the 1st. But before more is said about Lightfoot's study of Ignatius, his commentaries on the Pauline epistles call for attention. Pauline epistles, one of the most serious of the tensions of the Apostolic Age was that between Paul and the Judaizers who tried to dilute his law-free gospel with an infusion of legalism. This tension is documented preeminently in the letter of Galatians. It was appropriate then that the first installment of Lightfoot's New Testament assignment should be his commentary on Galatians, 1865. It was indeed the first installment of the whole triple project launched by Westcott and Hall and himself, and it remains one of the great commentaries on Galatians. I should not quarrel with anyone who maintains this still is the greatest. In a number of respects, of course, a work published in 1865 is inevitably dated. For example, W.M. Ramsay's researches into the historical geography of Asia Minor did not begin until 15 years later, and one aspect of the study of Galatians has never been the same since then. But the foundation of Lightfoot's work was sound, and the structure has stood the test of time. When the commentary was published, Hort regretted that it was inadequate on the theological side. In fact, Lightfoot was wise not to venture into the field of speculative theology in which Hort was interested. His strength lay on the historical side, and the need for the hour was for the reinforcement of the historical foundation of the Christian faith. This was the need which Lightfoot so signally met. He rarely refers to Barr, and certainly did not make it his business to offer direct rebuttal of the arguments of the Tubberger school. Instead, he went back, as Barr and his colleagues did, to the source and found that the study of them led to quite different conclusions from the Tubberger school. Some of the issues raised by Barr and others are dealt with in dissertations, including in the Galatian volume, The Brethren of the Lord, and especially St. Paul and the three pillars of the Jerusalem church. In discussing St. Paul and the three, Lightfoot had no difficulty in showing that there was no sharp opposition in the point between Paul and Peter. Paul does not suggest that there was any essential difference between his gospel and Peter's, and the whole point of this charge of dissimulation against Peter at Antioch in Galatians 2:13 lay in the fact that Peter was in the basic agreement with his own position as regard to table fellowship with Gentiles. As for the apostolic decree of Acts 15:28, Lightfoot might have been better advised not to treat it as the product of the same conference as the reported by Paul in Galatians 2:10. This is Bruce speaking, by the way. However, that may be, the question of Paul's relation to the decree would require fuller treatment today than it receives in Lightfoot's dissertation. In particular, he does not deal adequately with Paul's silence about the decree in response about food sacrificing idols in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, 1-11. And with this fact that whereas the decree forbids the eating of such food, Paul permits it except where it would harm the conscience either of the eater or others, he might have tackled these problems in greater depth had been able to write a commentary on 1 Corinthians. Lightfoot, however, warns against investing the church of apostolic days with an ideal excellence. In its inward dissensions, no less than the outward sufferings, the primitive church proved the truth of the Lord's warning that he came not to send peace on earth but a sword. The second in the series of Pauline commentaries was Philippians in 1868, and the third one was Colossians and Philemon in 1875. Philippians is probably the best known for the dissertation on the Christian ministry. Appended to it, a dissertation which remains a classic on the subject. In Colossians and Philemon, careful attention is paid to the nature of the Colossian heresy. That there was a Colossian heresy, Lightfoot had no doubt. It was, he concluded, a form of Essene Ebionitism. He enhanced the value of his commentary with a dissertation on the Essenes, running to more than 80 pages. When one considers the nonsense that was being written about the Essenes in Lightfoot's day, not to mention the nonsense that is still being written about 100 years later, Lightfoot's dissertation is outstanding as a scholarly and authoritative account of the sect, based on the ancient sources which were extant at the time. Whether the Qumran community, whose writings have come to light since 1947, belong to the Essenes or not, the Qumran discoveries have provided the study of the Essenes with a new context. In the light of this new context, the up-to-date quality of Lightfoot's treatment is the more impressive. The recluse ascetic brotherhood which was gathered about the shores of the Dead Sea does not appear above the evangelist horizon. Attempts have been made, Lightfoot points out, to link John the Baptist and James and the Lord's brother with the Essenes. Similar attempts have been made in our own day. His refutation of the arguments for such links retains its validity against more recent arguments to the same effect. Little can be added and nothing of importance to what Lightfoot wrote in 1875, which shows you the absolute sterlingness and brilliance of his scholarship. The Apostolic Fathers, before the publication of Colossians and Philemon, Lightfoot had produced the first installment of his edition of the Apostolic Fathers, a volume of Clement of Rome in 1869, a supplementary volume dealing with the new evidence for the text, which had become accessible, appeared in 1877, and a revision of the whole was published in 1890. His work on Ignatius and Polycarp appeared in 1885 in 2 volumes. Actually 3, for volume 2 was published in 2 separate sections. A revised and enlarged edition appeared in 1889. Lightfoot also made preparation for an edition of Barnabas and Hermes, but he did not live to produce this. His edition of Ignatius is his greatest and most important work. Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, is said by Eusebius to have been sent to Rome to be exposed to wild beasts in the arena and to have written 7 letters while he was passing through province of Asia. Letters attributed to Ignatius survived in manuscript tradition throughout the Middle Ages, and they were first printed in Latin translation in 1498. By then, they numbered more than 7. Some of these were clearly spurious. There was also 13 others in circulation. Some of these were clearly spurious, even those which corresponded to the 7 mentioned by Eusebius contained interpolations and manifested later than the time of Ignatius. But 3 17th century scholars, James Ussher, Isaac Voss, and John Pearson, did much to establish the uninterpolated text of the genuine letters. The uninterpolated Ignatius text reflects a situation a generation or 2 later than the bulk of the New Testament. If then the letters of Ignatius were written earlier than 117, the bulk of the New Testament must be dated in the 1st century. To establish the genuineness of the uninterpolated letters beyond reasonable doubt was therefore a service of the first magnitude to the study of the New Testament. This was the service which Lightfoot accomplished. The Tubman school might deny the authenticity of any of the letters attributed to Ignatius, but what was the evidence? What was the conclusions to which it pointed? These were the questions which Lightfoot addressed himself, and so thoroughly did he vindicate the genuineness of the 7 uninterpolated letters that his arguments have never been refuted, and few have dissented from his conclusions. His work represents a triumph for the historical critical method. Bishop Stephen Neale knew what he was about when he said that if he had his way, at least 500 pages of Lightfoot's Apostolic Fathers would be required reading for every theological student in his first year. That presupposes, of course, that every theological student in his first year is sufficiently competent in Greek to follow Lightfoot's arguments. If theology is grammar applied to the text, Lightfoot was a consummate theologian, but perhaps his generation was that in which Greek scholarship in English reached a level of unmatched in later generations. Lightfoot himself feared that this might be so. I should be glad to think my apprehensions groundless, but there is at least some reason to forebode that Greek scholarship has reached its height in England, and that henceforth it may be expected to decline. While the first edition of Ignatius and Polycarp appeared in 1885, an important part of its argument had been published in a more popular form a decade earlier. And in 1874, there appeared a work entitled Supernatural Religion, originally anonymous, but later revealed by Walter R. Cassel. This work was designed to recommend a form of Christian devoid of any supernatural element, and among its arguments it appeared to be the late dating of the Gospels approved by the Tubman school. Lightfoot might have paid too little attention to it had the author not gratuitously impugned the integrity of B.F. Westcott in a manner which betrayed his own linguistic incompetence. Closer examination showed that the author's case was vitiated by further instances of incompetence, which he exposed in a series of articles in the Contemporary Review in 1874 to 77. These articles were collected in a book form, Essays on the work entitled Supernatural Religion. This volume, an examination of the early witness of the 1st century origin of the Gospels, remains a valuable contribution to the study of early Christian literature. The 2 chapters of Papias, for example, sum up the significance of that writer as ably as ever been done. So what we're seeing here is J.B. Lightfoot getting involved in controversy, dealing with some hack scholar who denigrates the Gospels as not being written at that time of the first century, and defending B.F. Westcott's view of the Gospel of John, and defending the historical reliability of the Gospels. Other writings. Since Lightfoot was unable to complete commentaries on all of Paul's epistles, the trustees of his estate published a volume entitled Notes on the Epistles of Paul in 1895, and reproducing the main notes and lectures which he delivered in his Cambridge days, 1 and 2 Thessalonians, 1 Corinthians, Romans, and Ephesians. These notes contain a wealth of exegetical treasure, though they cannot be regarded as a substitute for full commentaries. Lightfoot's theology of the historic creeds and the 39 articles, his vindication of the firm historical foundation of the Christian faith, was the theological contribution which his generation required. Our own generation requires it no less today. We may regret that he left so much projected work unfinished, but he was a great scholar, and we need to remember his work and remember what he did in the study of the early church fathers and in Paul's epistles. Now, another thing that you need to know is that over the last few years, a scholar found some of J.B. Lightfoot's commentaries that had not been published in note form in some of J.B. Lightfoot's notes. So IVP have published these notes, and I put a link underneath, and I would encourage you to study J.B. Lightfoot. You'll learn, if you study him, you'll learn how to exegete text. You'll learn how to look at text in the historical context. So I'd encourage you to do that, and it will be a tremendous encouragement to you to preach. Don't necessarily agree with all his theology, but his methodology is a very meticulous scholar in terms of historical context, and that is a tradition that we need to remember. Okay, God bless you and take care.